I'd be better on my own. Sometimes what's right is wrong instead. 'Cause I was too young, and I didn't understand that you were no one, and I can't wait to see you hindsight is fleeting, oh, and your heart's bleeding, and all you can see is red, till you discover it is within each other to forgive.
All right, we're gonna start. Hello, everybody. Sorry about that. I had the wrong scene up about the first minute of the video, so we'll just start now without the countdown ending, because I had a 200 IQ moment and had the wrong scene up for about the first minute of the stream. So let's get into this today. Happy Monday, everybody. How's everybody doing? Glad to be here. Glad to be back. So today we're just gonna do the Mayhem Monday business, and it actually wound up not being as much mayhem as I thought it would be, but it's still going to be a couple of different topics. So let's see here. That's kind of loud, isn't it? Sorry, I set up a new music thing right before stream, so how's that? We good? Okay. I think we're good. So today, what's on the docket? We're going to talk about the IPCC report on the climate. Going to talk about World War II of all things. I know that's not current news, but I'll talk about some World War II stuff and the American exceptionalism that goes along with that, and a stunning new report, according to The Hill anyway. So if we have time for all of that, that's what's going to be on the docket for today. So that being said, let's just jump into this business here. Man, I am not prepared as I should have been. Okay. Let's get into this. First thing. The IPCC report itself, which we're not going to cover the whole thing. It's like 3,000 some odd pages long, so obviously we're not going to cover that whole thing, and I still haven't been able to read it all, so I'll have to read over it, and then we can talk about that all another day. But I'm going to touch on some of the main points, the main findings of that report. So let's see here. That's as big as it's going to go. The IPCC released its latest climate report today, Climate Change 2021, Physical Science Basis. And then it gives the quote, "The role of human influence on the climate system is undisputed." There is no arguments, there is no debate, there's no maybe this or maybe that. It is undisputed that humanity's role in this. Hang on, I'm gonna get rid of that for now, since we're gonna be watching videos. So let's watch this. This is the trailer for it. Come on, give me the. There we go. Okay, so that was just kind of a overview. I thought that would give more information, but I think the next tab that I have gives more information about kind of some of the bigger things that are in it. Okay. So yeah, basically they released this report today, outlining different scenarios, kind of talking about what it's too late to do and what there's still time to do if we do it now, kind of a thing. So hopefully this next UN. Let's see here. I'm gonna watch the video because I don't know if this is a transcript for the video or not. So we'll watch the video first, and then if that's not the transcript, then we'll read the article that goes along with the video.
The UN Climate Panel has released its most comprehensive assessment of climate change yet, and it doesn't make for a cheerful read.
Climate change is a fact that's already happening. It's, no matter what, not going to go away.
It's hot out here.
Drawing on more than 14,000 scientific studies, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report sounded a dire warning. The world is dangerously close to runaway warming, and greenhouse gas levels are high enough to guarantee climate disruption for decades. Here are some of the report's main takeaways. Humans are to blame, full stop. The first line of the report reads, It is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres described the report as a code red for humanity. The report describes possible futures depending on how dramatically the world cuts emissions. Even the severest of cuts are unlikely to prevent global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. But without immediate steep emissions cuts, average temperatures could cruise past 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the 21st century. Federico Otto is a climate scientist at Oxford University and an IPCC co-author.
There is no denying that some of the impacts are irreversible.
What's going on there? How are you? Watching, so they released, the IPCC released their climate report today, so we're just watching this video. That kind of gives some of the highlights and points in it about what's happening in the world and with climate change and how we can work to try and prevent some of the worst things from happening. So doing good there, doing good. It's good to see you here. I noticed you and Gubba got a win today in Fortnite, which is cool, huh? So yeah.
On centuries, on timescales of centuries to come, and this is really important to know also that climate change is a fact. It's already happening. It's not going to go away. So adapting to climate change is something as a policymaker you will probably want to keep in mind.
Weather extremes once considered rare or unprecedented are becoming more common. Severe heat waves that happened only once every 50 years are now happening roughly once a decade. Tropical cyclones are getting stronger, and most land areas are seeing more rain or snowfall in a year. Severe droughts are happening 1.7 times as often, and fire seasons are getting longer and more intense. Even if global warming were halted at 1.5 degrees Celsius, the average sea level would still rise about 6 to 10 feet, and maybe more. Summertime sea ice atop the Arctic Ocean will vanish entirely at least once by 2050, and that's the IPCC's most optimistic scenario. The report comes just 3 months before COP26, a major UN climate conference taking place in Glasgow. Nations will now be under even more pressure to pledge more ambitious climate action and substantial financing to go with it. Greenpeace UK Executive Director John Sorvin says the world needs to take note of this report and act immediately.
Scientists can produce reports, but scientists can't save the world. They can just tell us what is happening. This is absolutely down to governments. And there are only a few critical governments which are really important. If you look at China, China is responsible for more than a quarter of the world's emissions. We cannot solve this problem without China acting. As does financial centres like the City of London. There's a lot of private finance going into new fossil fuel projects, which also needs to stop.
Okay, that kind of ended abruptly, but that's okay. Let's see here. So this goes into maybe more. We'll see if this is just I guess this is an article to go along with it, so we'll cover that as well. It says the UN Climate Panel has released its most comprehensive assessment of climate change yet. And then that full report is 3,000 some odd pages long, so we're not going to read that whole thing, but here are some of the main report's main conclusions: humans are to blame, full stop. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, uses strongest terms yet to assert that humans are causing climate change. With first line of its report summary reading, it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. The stark language marked a shift from previous IPCC reports, which said it was extremely likely the industrial activity was to blame. So, this I actually like, because previously, climate scientists were giving their most conservative estimates for climate change and its effects, and they're starting to use stronger language, which I like. Hopefully, those who can do something about this will listen to them a little bit more if they use this stronger language. Because previously, to avoid being called alarmist or whatever, they've used the most conservative estimates, and we've blown right through every estimate of where they said that we would be right now. We've gone past that. So hopefully with this shift in their language, those with the power to do something will do something. Says there is no uncertainty language in this sentence because there is no uncertainty that global warming is caused by human activity and the burning of fossil fuels, said IPCC co-author Frederic Otto, a climatologist at University of Oxford. The report describes possible futures depending on how dramatically the world cuts emissions. But even the severest of cuts are unlikely to prevent global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial temperatures. Without immediate steep emission cuts, though, average temperatures could cruise past 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. The scientists also looked at events considered less likely but still possible, and they could not rule out big impacts from so-called tipping points, such as loss of Arctic ice or the dieback of forests. Weather extremes once considered rare or unprecedented are becoming more common, a trend that will continue even if the world limits global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Severe heat waves that happened once every 50 years are now happening roughly once a decade. Tropical cyclones are getting stronger. Most land areas are seeing more rain or snowfall in a year. Severe droughts are happening 1.7 times as often, and fire seasons are getting longer and more intense. I guess that's just a picture. Scientific advances in the last decade are also helping scientists detect whether climate change caused or worsened specific weather events. In the past, people would say you can't say anything about any individual event, says IPCC co-author Michael Werner, climate scientist at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory in California. But now we can actually make quantitative statements about extreme weather events. Summertime sea ice atop the Arctic Ocean will vanish entirely at least once by 2050, under the IPCC's most optimistic scenario. The region is the fastest warming area of the globe, warming at least twice as fast as the global average. Why does that keep popping up? While Arctic sea ice levels vary throughout the year, the average lows during summer have been decreasing since the 1970s and are now at their lowest levels in 1,000 years. This melting creates a feedback loop, with reflective ice giving way to darker water that absorbs solar radiation, causing even more warming. Sea levels are sure to keep rising for hundreds or thousands of years, even if global warming were halted at 1.5 degrees Celsius. The average sea level would still rise about 2 to 3 meters, 6 to 10 feet, and maybe more. Sea level rise has picked up speed as polar ice sheets melt and warming ocean waters expands. Already, associated flooding has nearly doubled in many coastal areas since the 1960s, with once-in-a-century coastal surges set to occur once a year by 2100. Scientists could not rule out extreme rises of more than 15 meters by 2300 if tipping points trigger runaway warming. The more we push the climate system, the greater the odds we cross thresholds that we can only poorly project. Said IPCC co-author Bob Kopp, a climate scientologist at Rutgers University. Meeting the Paris Agreement goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius will require sticking to a carbon budget, a term describing how much additional carbon can be pumped into the atmosphere before the goal is likely out of reach. The world is now on track to use up that budget in about a decade. With 2.4 trillion tons of climate warming CO2 added to the atmosphere since the mid-1800s, the average global temperatures have risen by 1.1 degrees Celsius. That leaves 400 billion tons more that can be added before the carbon budget is blown. Global emissions currently total a little more than 40 billion tons a year. All right, so, yeah, we should probably do something about that. Okay, and like I said, I'll have to read over the full report to find out everything that's in it. But it's over 3,000 pages long, so it's going to take a minute to do. And it just came out today. So, oh, yeah, here we go. This is always fun. The Exxon playbook, lobbying Democrats, carbon taxes that will never happen, shadow groups to fight climate efforts. So this was Greenpeace posing as a company looking for lobbyists and speaking to a couple of lobbyists for Exxon, who's been lying for decades about the effects of global warming and carbon emissions. Let's find out what they had to say.
Such that it would be difficult to categorize them all.
Did we join some of these shadow groups to work against some of the early efforts? Yes, that's true. But there's nothing illegal about that.
Yeah. This is Keith McCoy, one of ExxonMobil's top Capitol Hill lobbyists. And this is Dan Easley. Until February this year, he was Exxon's leading White House lobbyist. Unearthed posed as recruitment consultants and told them we had a client who admired their work. Then we interviewed them on Zoom and asked them to tell us what they and the other lobbyists at Exxon have been up to. ExxonMobil is so powerful that the management suite at its global headquarters is known as the God Pod. Until recently, it was the biggest, richest corporation in the history of the world. For decades, critics have claimed Exxon deploys cynical, aggressive lobbying techniques to pull the strings of government while running clandestine campaigns to block action on climate change, discredit its opponents, and distract attention from its polluting activities. But not one of its serving senior executives has ever come clean about the Exxon playbook, until now. Here's what Dan Easley and Keith McCoy told us. Mr. McCoy revealed that behind the scenes, the company has been working hard to undermine President Biden's $2 trillion infrastructure plan. The White House proposal included spending hundreds of billions on clean energy and transport as part of the most ambitious clean energy legislation ever proposed by a U.S. president. And it would have been paid for by higher taxes on corporations like Exxon. But these ambitious proposals are on the verge of being defeated. According to Mr. McCoy, Exxon has been working to scale back the legislation and stop Exxon paying more tax. He told us which United States senators the company sought to recruit to their lobbying campaign. And they're not all Republicans.
We're playing defense because President Biden's talking about this big infrastructure package, and he's going to pay for it by increasing corporate taxes. You stick to highways and bridges, then a lot of the negative stuff starts to come out because
for you guys,
because there's a germaneness, right? That doesn't make any sense for a highway bill. Why would you put in a something on emissions reductions on climate change to oil refineries in a highway bill?
Who's the crucial guys for you?
Well, Senator Capito, who's the ranking member on Environment and Public Works, Joe Manchin, I talk to his office every week. He is the kingmaker on this because he's a Democrat from West Virginia, which is a very conservative state. And he's not shy about sort of staking his claim early and completely changing the debate. So on the Democrat side, we look for the moderates on these issues. So it's the Manchins, it's the Cinemas, it's the Testers.
Exxon is even trying to get through to President Biden through his friend, Senator Chris Coons.
Other ones that aren't talked about is Senator Coons, who's from Delaware, who has a very close relationship with Senator Biden. So we've been working with his office. Matter of fact, our CEO is talking to him next Tuesday. Then you take it out a little bit more and you say, okay, well, who's up for re-election in 2022? That's Hassan, that's Kelly. And then obviously the Republicans. We have a great relationship with the senators where we have assets. I can't worry about the 2027 class because they're not focused on re-election. The 2022 class is focused on re-election. So I know I have them. Those are the Marco Rubios. Those are the Senator Kennedys. Those are the Senator Daines. So you can have those conversations with them because they're a captive audience. They know they need you and I need them.
Dan Easley left Exxon earlier this year after nearly 8 years lobbying for the corporation. He described just how big a problem Biden's original proposal posed for oil and gas companies.
Oh, it's going to be replete with provisions that will be difficult for oil and gas. Take away tax, favorable tax treatment. They're going to raise the corporate rate, and then a whole host of new environmental requirements, right. and procurement requirements from the federal government to purchase, green energy and renewable technologies, and retrofitting federal buildings, and all of. It's going to accelerate the transition to the extent that I think 4 years from now, it's going to be difficult to unwind that. So we're all living in a different world.
For years, Exxon has claimed it supports a carbon tax. When they came out for the policy, it surprised a lot of people. But does Exxon really believe in a carbon tax? Or is it a ploy to make the company look responsible while giving them cover to aggressively oppose climate regulations that would hit their bottom line?
Nobody is going to propose a tax on all Americans. And the cynical side of me says, yeah, we kind of know that, but it gives us a talking point that we can say, well, what is ExxonMobil for? Well, we're for a carbon tax.
What you said was just really interesting. So it's basically never going to happen, right? Is the calculation?
Yeah. No, it's not going to. A carbon tax isn't going to happen.
So this helps me understand a little bit why suddenly a lot of US oil majors are talking about a carbon tax, because it sounds pretty.
Well, the cynical side of me, they've got nothing else. It's an easy talking point to say, look, I'm for a carbon tax. So that's the talking point. That is in my mind, an effective advocacy tool.
Until February, Dan Easley was Exxon's main man lobbying the White House. He gave us an insight into the relationship between Exxon and the previous administration when he detailed the successive lobbying victories the company secured under Trump. This includes issuing thousands of new oil and gas drilling permits, which critics argue are incompatible with efforts to tackle climate change.
The executive branch and regulatory team for Exxon had extraordinary success over the last 4 years, in large part because the administration was so predisposed to helping.
What were the big wins you got out of Trump?
You should Google ExxonMobil announcement and Donald Trump. So he live Facebooked from the West Wing our big Drilling the Gulf project. He mentioned us in 2 states of the union.
Yeah.
We were able to get investor-state dispute settlement protections in NAFTA. We were able to rationalize the permitting environment and, get tons of permits out. I mean, the wins are such that it would be difficult to categorize them all. I mean, tax has to be the biggest one, right? The reduction of the corporate rate and was it's probably worth billions to Exxon. So yeah, I mean, there were a lot of wins.
Mr. McCoy then told us how Exxon aggressively fought to discredit climate science. He also told us how, even now, talking down solutions to global warming, like renewable energy and electric vehicles, is critically important to the work Exxon does in Washington, D.C.
Did we aggressively fight against some of the science? Yes. Did we hide our science? Absolutely not. Did we join some of these shadow groups to work against some of the early efforts? Yes, that's true. But there's nothing illegal about that. We were looking out for our investments. We were looking out for our shareholders. And you're not going to be able to just switch to battery-operated vehicles or wind for your electricity, and just having that conversation around why that's not possible in the next 10 years is critically important to the work that we do. So, and that's at every phase. That's in the Senate, that's in the House, that's with the administration. Something like climate change, there's some forest fires, there's an increase of, 0.001, Celsius. That doesn't affect people's everyday lives.
For decades, the decisions made in Exxon's God Pod have had an impact on the lives of every American, maybe every human being on the planet. They held back action on climate change and used their power and money to ensure Washington politicians were working for them, not us. Now we have a better idea of what they did and how they did it. And crucially, now we know they're still doing it. ExxonMobil released this statement.
The report contained a number of important factual misstatements that are starkly at odds with our positions, including on climate policy and our firm commitment to carbon pricing. Our lobbying efforts on the infrastructure bill are related to a tax burden that could disadvantage U.S. business. We have supported climate science for decades. Our lobbying efforts comply with all laws and are publicly disclosed.
Go to unearthed.greenpeace.org to read the company's full response.
Okay, so that's what we're up against. If we want to I'll have to watch that another day. That's what we're up against if we want to have any action on this latest climate report is the people that can do something about it are bought and paid for by the people who are profiting off of the earth being destroyed. So it's an uphill battle for sure. So let's see. That's 7 minutes. So yeah, moving on to some World War II stuff, and I'm doing this particularly because, actually, you know what? Let's cover this first. Just because I thought it was funny when I saw it pop up in my timeline. A stunning new report ranks U.S. dead last in healthcare among richest countries despite spending the most. So I replied, how exactly is it stunning that this new report says the same thing every older report has been saying? The U.S. has been spending more and having the worst outcomes in any country for decades. So I don't know why this uses the word stunning.
The U.S. healthcare system ranked
or new. Aside from it's the newest report, and it says the same thing that all the other reports have been saying about our healthcare system in this country. We spend more than any other industrialized country on healthcare and have the worst outcomes in the world. So anyway, that just made me laugh when I saw that. So I had to throw that in here just for a little bit of a chuckle about, I don't know who wrote this stunning new part, but they should be fired. So now we can go on to World War II, and it kind of ties into the healthcare thing in that both involve American exceptionalism and a shitload of propaganda to get us to believe things about ourselves that are not factually true, not correct. So this is an older clip. It's from June, and you may have seen it. And it's been covered from a lot of angles. I want to cover it from kind of the American exceptionalism angle, and how that has distorted our history and the way we teach about ourselves, and the dangers and damages that can lead to. So we'll watch this quick little video. It's about the end of the war. End of World War II in Europe, and who really won. And it's awesome to watch, by the way, especially if you've escaped some of that American exceptionalism and you've learned actual history. It's just amazing to watch the American education system on full display from this Emily person, and Ryan Grimm, who tries to correct the nonsense that she's spouting. So we'll watch that real quick, and then kind of go into some other lies out of World War II that we've told ourselves.
Representative Ilhan Omar is receiving backlash from both sides of the aisle for recent comments in which she grouped the U.S. and Israel with terrorist groups. Let's throw her tweet up on the screen. You can see it right there. The Congresswoman said, "We must have the same level of accountability and justice for all victims of crimes against humanity. We have seen unthinkable atrocities committed by the U.S., Hamas, Israel, Afghanistan, and the Taliban." Ryan, I think that was misstated. I wonder if she would actually take it back. She has since defended it, but I wonder if she would say that maybe differently if she could. What do you think? Do you think she actually intended to have that sort of equivalence? And would you defend the equivalence if you were her?
Yes, of course. I mean, the right on this wants to have it both ways. You know, they want to go around when they can trigger the left and say all lives matter. But then when it comes to victims of U.S. imperialism, of whom there are probably tens of millions in the second half of the 20th century, all of a sudden lives are different. Some lives matter. If you were taken by an enemy, if you're a life that was taken by an enemy of the United States, if you fell at the hands of communists or terrorists, then your life mattered. If you are an Indonesian member of the Communist Party there and you're one of the 500,000 to 1 million people annihilated in that genocide, that U.S.-backed genocide, then your life doesn't matter. I don't understand, maybe you can help explain it to me, how it is anti-Semitic to talk about American history in an accurate way.
Well, I don't think this comment is particularly anti-Semitic, since
they're coming after her. Like
I'm not.
According to John Bresnahan with Punchbowl,
even Democrats.
Jewish Democrats in the House, he reported, are putting together or working on a statement calling her anti-Semitic for making this argument.
I mean, I think you're all about the Benjamin's tweet is still the clearest example that there may be anti-Semitism lurking in her worldview. But I would also say, in this case, when you include the United States with Israel in the equivalence between the Taliban and Hamas, I think it's clearly not targeted in the way that a charge of anti-Semitism would say. I do think it's extremely offensive to the establishment. I agree in this case because I think the Taliban and Hamas are forces for evil, and where you say the United States has also been a force of evil, that there are victims of United States imperialism, I think what that does is wash over people that the United States has saved through its actions. There is two sides to that, right? There are, I can admit, absolutely, of course, there are victims.
But try to say the same thing and say, well, Hamas builds hospitals and schools, and the
Taliban
and the Taliban eradicated a lot of corruption around Afghanistan, and the Soviet Union raised living standards throughout. So if we're going to do this thing, well, okay, yes, it's true that U.S. imperialism killed tens of millions of people, but they also did good things. Then why does that only apply to the U.S. and not to all of these other countries, the evil empire? Because
the level of good, I think, that the United States has had around the world is wildly out. The balance there between good and bad is nowhere where it is compared to the Taliban.
You would have a hard time making that case in most countries where the U.S. intervened.
Right. No, I understand that completely, but that doesn't change my viewpoint, and I don't think it changes the facts that the balance of good and bad worldwide over the course of the United States' existence, it's silly to whitewash the bad. It's absolutely silly to whitewash bad. There has been plenty of it, but on the other side, on the balance, I think the United States has done incredible good around the world, continues to do incredible good around the world in a way that could never and should never be compared with the Taliban or Hamas.
I would agree in this sense that when it comes to the amount of pain and suffering that the U.S. has produced around the world, the Taliban, Hamas, and Israel are pikers compared to what the U.S. has been able to accomplish just in, say, Argentina, or just in Indonesia, or just in Vietnam, or just in Congo, or just you could throw a dart anywhere at the global map, and you can probably find, at some point throughout the 20th century, the U.S. intervening to undermine some type of social democratic effort and backing the most vicious right-wing elements. And the irony of them calling this anti-Semitism when the U.S. very consciously and explicitly out of World War II allied itself with former Nazis, helped Nazis escape justice, was complicit in what was called the rat line, with getting Nazis out of Germany and into these death squads that were run by the United States and deployed in an anti-communist fashion against the Soviet Union and against leftist elements in South America.
But who ended the Holocaust? I mean, what country?
The Soviet Union, actually.
Okay, but
I mean, the Soviet Union did that.
No,
we walked in after the Russians had suffered 20+ million casualties and marched into Germany.
Sure, but without the United States' intervention, a heck of a lot more people would have died in that atrocity.
Yes, and I'm glad the Soviet Union and the United States allied to beat Nazi Germany, but the Nazi Germany, the Nazis themselves then allied with the United States to go after the Soviet Union and to go after communist and social democratic elements in South America. That's an actual part of the history.
Right, but again, there's lives being saved in that process, a lot of lives being saved in that process, and a lot of Americans putting their lives on the line and dying to save those lives.
Sure, but many fewer than Soviet lives died to take on the Nazis.
But that doesn't change the fact that the United States intervened and risked lots and lots of lives compared to what it may have been complicit in, or what it may have been, lives it may have costed on the other side of that. I think, again, the balance there is clearly on the side of good in a way that you can't apply to the Taliban or Hamas. I would much rather have I would take the establishment government of the United States over the governing forces and the establishment of the Taliban any day. I'm glad we're in the American empire, not the Taliban empire.
Wait till you hear who funded the Taliban at the very beginning.
Well, there is that. That's not a bad point, Ryan. Ryan says he thinks the Congresswoman was giving an overly generous view of U.S. history. Here's his tweet. This is basically what we just discussed.
Yeah, and I mean, no, this is maybe it's not that right exactly. So my point there is that if you actually tallied up the body count and if you said all lives matter, that the U.S. death count is orders of magnitude higher than the other 3 countries that she lumped them with. So in that sense, I would say it's unfair to those other countries.
Which is exactly what we just worked through in terms of tallying things up.
All right, Emily. Tomorrow on Rising, David Sirota is here, and Matt Stoller explains why it's time.
Okay, so if you watch that clip and you grew up in the United States and you were educated here, you learned history here, Emily sounds like a rational, thinking human being. If you grew up anywhere else in the world, Ryan Grimm is the person that you're looking at this person and going, man, she's fucking out of her mind. What the fuck is she talking about? But that's what we're taught in the U.S. is all this nonsense and bullshit and propaganda. She was spouting about how awesome America was and how we won the war and how we're a force for good in the world. No. No, we're not. We're none of those things. And the reason I bring that up is because I saw this tweet today that kind of sparked this in me. This American exceptionalism again. This propagandized view of how America is this force for good in the world. When in reality, we are the world's biggest bully. We are the single biggest exporter of terrorism in the world. Anyway, so Human Rights Watch Watcher tweeted out, "It's incredibly disturbing how many Americans continue to try to justify the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hundreds of thousands of people were dissolved in a split second, and we're taught to defend these heinous atrocities. We live in a death cult, plain and simple." And then what really caught me was all the comments. You can tell who learned their world history in the United States. This person, #vaccinated. If that hadn't been done, millions upon millions more would have been killed in the war. And the possibility of both Japan and Germany invading the USA was a very real possibility. We would have been having a very different perspective if that would have happened. I don't know what the fuck this person's talking about, honestly. This is just insanity. Because again, this tweet reinforces this tweet. Like this tweet is saying, yeah, you're fucking ridiculous. And this person comes down here and goes, and like throws their ignorance onto the timeline of this person who's saying this view is ignorant. And this person comes down here and throws the ignorant view into the timeline like he's making a point. Well, see, most learned it prevented some 10 million deaths by the invasion of Japan to the end of the Pacific War. Would you disagree? Yes. And so would the military leaders in the U.S. At the time, which we'll show you in just a minute. Jordan Rogers. What about all the insane atrocities? Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, what about all the insane atrocities we committed? Oh. What if we had invaded Japan? That's another just bullshit statement about, well, if we had to invade Japan, millions of our soldiers would have died. Oh, and #vaccinated wasn't done. War is the most awful thing that can happen to us as humans, but the alternative would have been far worse. I don't condone killing at all, and what happened to the Japanese was horrific, but they wouldn't have ever stopped, and neither would the Nazis. Again, What the fuck are you talking about, dude? By the time we bomb, this guy keeps saying the Germans would have invaded. By the time we dropped the atomic bombs on Japan, Germany had already surrendered. You dumb fuck. What the fuck is wrong with you? Jesus Christ, man. See, this is what I'm talking about. American exceptionalism. Alright, well, the comments are just more of that kind of... Yeah, if it hadn't been done, millions would have died. Japan would have fought till there was nobody left. It was the only way to end the war. Again, this is the bullshit that we get taught. It's not true. Frustrates the hell out of me. The Hiroshima myth, and by extension, the Nagasaki myth. Every year during the first 2 weeks of August, the mass news media and many politicians at the national level shout out the patriotic political myth. The dropping of 2 atomic bombs on Japan in August of 1945 caused them to surrender, and thereby saved the lives of anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million American soldiers who did not have to invade the island. Opinion polls over the last 50 years show American citizens overwhelmingly believe this false history, which of course makes them feel better about killing hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians, mostly women and children, and saving American lives to accomplish the ending of the war. The best book, in my opinion, to explode this myth is The Decision to Use the Bomb by Gar Alperovitz, because it not only explains the real reasons the bombs were dropped, but also gives a detailed history of how and why the myth was created, that the slaughter of innocent civilians was justified and therefore morally acceptable. The essential problem starts with President Franklin Roosevelt's policy of unconditional surrender, which was reluctantly adopted by Churchill and Stalin, and which President Truman decided to adopt when he succeeded Roosevelt in April of 1945. Hanson Baldwin was the principal writer for the New York Times who covered World War II, and he wrote an important book immediately after the war entitled Great Mistakes of the War. Baldwin concludes that the unconditional surrender policy was perhaps the biggest political mistake of the war. Unconditional surrender was an open invitation to unconditional resistance. It discouraged opposition to Hitler, probably lengthened the war, cost us lives, and helped to lead to the present aborted peace. The stark fact is that the Japanese leaders, both military and civilian, including the emperor, were willing to surrender in May of 1945. Okay, May 1945. We dropped the bombs in August of 1945. If the emperor could remain in place and not be subjected to war crimes trials after the war, this fact became known to President Truman as early as May of 1945. The Japanese monarchy was one of the oldest in all of history, dating back to 660 BC. The Japanese religion added the belief that all the emperors were the direct descendants of the sun goddess Amaterasu. Man, I butchered that, I'm sorry. The reigning emperor Hirohito was the 124th in the direct line of descent. After the bombs were dropped on August 6th and 9th of 1945 and their surrender soon thereafter, the Japanese were allowed to keep their emperor on the throne, and he was not subjected to any war crimes trial. The emperor Hirohito came to the throne in 1926 and continued in his position until his death in 1989. Since President Truman in effect accepted the conditional surrender offered by the Japanese as early as May of 1945, the question is posed: why then were the bombs dropped? All right, so basically in May of 1945, they were looking to surrender based on this condition that the emperor could stay. And yet in August of 1945, we still dropped 2 atomic bombs on their civilian populations. So now the question is, why then were the bombs dropped? The author Alperovitz gives us the answer in great detail, which can only be surmised here, but he states, "We have noted a series of Japanese peace feelers in Switzerland, which OSS Chief William Donovan reported to Truman in May and June 1945. These suggested, even at this point, that the U.S. demand for unconditional surrender might well be the only serious obstacle to peace. At the center of the explorations, as we also saw, was Alan Dulles, chief of OSS operations in Switzerland and subsequently director of the CIA. In his 1966 book, The Secret Surrender, Dulles recalled that on July 20th, 1945, under instructions from Washington, I went to the Potsdam Conference and reported there to Secretary of War Stimson on what I had learned from Tokyo. They desired to surrender if they could retain the emperor and their constitution as a basis for maintaining discipline and order in Japan after the devastating news of surrender became known to the Japanese people. It is documented by the author that Stimson reported this directly to Truman. Alperovitz further points out in detail the documentary proof that every top presidential, civilian, and military advisor, with the exception of James Burns, along with Prime Minister Churchill and his top British military leadership, urged Truman to revise the unconditional surrender policy so as to allow the Japanese to surrender and keep their emperor. All this advice was given to Truman prior to the Potsdam Proclamation, which occurred on July 26, 1945. This proclamation made a final demand upon Japan to surrender unconditionally or suffer drastic consequences. Another startling fact about the military connection to the dropping of the bombs is the lack of knowledge on the part of General MacArthur about the existence of the bomb and whether it was to be dropped. Alperovitz states, MacArthur knew nothing about advanced planning for atomic bombs use until almost last minute, nor was he personally in the chain of command in this connection. The order came straight from Washington. Indeed, the War Department waited until 5 days before the bombing of Hiroshima, even to notify MacArthur. The commanding general of the U.S. Army Forces in the Pacific, of the existence of the atomic bomb. Alperovitz makes it very clear the main person Truman was listening to while he ignored all of his civilian and military advice was James Burns, the man who virtually controlled Truman at the beginning of his administration. Burns was one of the most experienced political figures in Washington, having served for over 30 years in both the House and the Senate. He had also served as the United States Supreme Court Justice, and at the request of President Roosevelt, he resigned that position and accepted the role in the Roosevelt administration of managing the domestic economy. Burns went to the Yalta Conference with Roosevelt and then was given the responsibility to go to Congress and the American people to accept the agreement made at Yalta. When Truman became a senator in 1935, Burns immediately became his friend and mentor and remained close to Truman until Truman became president. Truman never forgot and immediately called on Burns to be his number 2 man in the new administration. Burns had expected to be named the vice presidential candidate to FDR to replace Henry Wallace, and had been disappointed when Truman had been named. Yet he and Truman remained very close. Burns had also been very close to Roosevelt, while Truman was kept in the dark by Roosevelt most of the time he served as vice president. Truman asked Burns immediately in April to become his Secretary of State, but they delayed the official appointment until July 3rd, 1945, so as not to offend the incumbent. Burns had also accepted a position on the interim committee, which had control over the policy regarding the atom bomb, and therefore in April 1945 became Truman's main foreign policy advisor, and especially the advisor on the use of the atomic bomb. It was Burns who encouraged Truman to postpone the Potsdam Conference and his meeting with Stalin until they could know at the conference if the atomic bomb was successfully tested. While at the Potsdam Conference, the experiments proved successful, and Truman advised Stalin that a new massively destructive weapon was now available to America, which Burns hoped would make Stalin back off from any excessive demands or activity in the post-war period. Truman secretly gave the orders on July 25, 1945, that the bomb would be dropped in August, while he was to be en route back to America. On July 26, he issued the Potsdam Proclamation, or ultimatum to Japan to surrender, leaving in place the unconditional surrender policy, thereby causing both Truman and Burns to believe that the terms would not be accepted by Japan. The conclusion drawn unmistakably from the evidence presented is that Burns is the man who convinced Truman to keep the unconditional surrender policy and not accept Japan's surrender, so that the bombs could actually be dropped, thereby demonstrating to the Russians, that America had a new forceful leader in place, a new sheriff in Dodge who, unlike Roosevelt, was going to be tough with the Russians on foreign policy, and that the Russians needed to back off during what would become known as the Cold War. A secondary reason was that Congress would now be told about why they had made the secret appropriation to a Manhattan Project, and the huge expenditure would be justified by showing that not only did the bombs work, but they would bring war to an end and make the Russians back off, and enable America to become the most powerful military force in the world. Okay, so Japan was set to surrender, mostly because Russia had declared war on them. And they knew that at that point the war was over, that they couldn't win. So they looked to Russia to negotiate a surrender. And we decided to murder hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians in Japan in order to show Russia that we had a big dick. That was basically it. If the surrender by the Japanese had been accepted between May and the end of July, and the emperor had been left in place, as in fact he was after the bombing, this would have kept Russia out of the war. Russia agreed at Yalta to come into the Japanese war 3 months after Germany surrendered. In fact, Germany surrendered on May 8th, 1945, and Russia announced on August 8th, exactly 3 months thereafter, that it was abandoning its neutrality policy with Japan and entering the war. Okay, so August 8th. Russia's entry into the war for 6 days allowed them to gain tremendous power and influence in China, Korea, and other key areas of Asia. The Japanese were deathly afraid of communism, and if the Potsdam Proclamation had indicated that America would accept the conditional surrender, allowing the emperor to remain in place, and informed the Japanese that Russia would enter the war if they did not surrender, then this would surely have assured a quick Japanese surrender. So again, they left the unconditional surrender in, specifically so that Japan would not surrender. For the reasons, for the purpose of the U.S. being able to use the atomic bomb on Japan to show off to Russia about how big our dick was. That's it. Again. I think this just goes on. I think that's basically it, though. So yeah, all that stuff that we get taught in America about we had to use the atomic bomb to save millions of lives. It's all bullshit. None of it's true. It's all propaganda. It's all part of the Red Scare. It all has to do with the Cold War and Russia, and so we basically murdered hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians, not to save lives, but to show the world that we were the big bads, and it worked. So when you get, let's see, where's that? Open that closed tab. When you get these people and the replies saying stuff like this, saying stuff like all of this, saying all of this stuff, saying all of this stuff about we had to do it. No, we didn't. We didn't have to do it. So anyway, seeing that kind of set me off. And so, yeah, I thought I'd talk about it. Especially to anybody who's watching from the US. You and I were taught these things that just simply were not true. And hopefully this clears some of that up. But again, American exceptionalism is a dangerous thing. And it's really going to kill us all. So, let's see. Final thoughts. Okay. So we talked about the IPCC report, which, like I said, I haven't been able to read it yet. It just came out today. But it's important that we... Oh, let's see. Let's turn some music back on here. There we go. It's important that we man, electoralism is just not going to solve our problems, so it's hard to say what the solution is. But you can't just throw your hands up and say, well, we're fucked, so enjoy the ride. So it's important to let the people in power that can do something know that you want them to do something. Know that you want them to take this report seriously and do something about it. And so that our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren have a place to live. And not just that, but all the life that faces extinction if we don't change course rapidly. Not just humans, but everything now living on Earth is in danger of extinction. And the profit over people, profit over everything that comes with capitalism needs to crumble and collapse, and do so very, very quickly, because it is going to kill us all. I keep hitting my microphone, I'm sorry. And then what else did we talk about? Oh yeah, the healthcare thing. The new report about the United States spending more on healthcare than any nation and having the worst health outcomes, which is not new. And then, of course, the things that we're taught in school about our history. Learn to take it with a grain of salt. Learn to take it with some skepticism, because we like to lie to ourselves, say how great we are, and the rest of the world doesn't feel that way, for good reason. So I think with that, head off. Thank you to everyone who came by, to everyone who lurked. Thanks for the chat from Dare. Appreciate you coming in and saying hi. And of course, next stream will be Wednesday. Again, 7 p.m. Eastern. And I'm still kind of trying to work out a schedule that works. So schedules might be changing. I think Wednesday will stay evenings. I'm kind of looking at changing maybe Monday to a different time. But anyway, yeah, follow me on Twitter Twitter /real deGENerX for updates on that, updates on schedule, and what else? Yeah, and we'll keep streaming. Seems to be going okay. So we'll keep streaming on Twitch and YouTube at the same time. Follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/deGENerX. Or over on YouTube, you can just search deGENerX. For now, I don't have the fancy custom URL with YouTube yet. So if you just search deGENerX on YouTube, you can find my channel that way. Yeah, other than that, thank you again for stopping by. Have an amazing Monday evening. I'll see you all on Wednesday. Oh, I'm sorry about at the beginning of the stream having the wrong scene on. So anyway, yeah, thank you again. Have an amazing evening, everybody. Bye.